Charles Darwin is called the father of modern biology. His face is on merchandise, his name is in every textbook, and his ideas are taught as settled science in virtually every university on Earth. But according to one author's detailed critique, Darwin never proved a single reproducible experiment. Not one. Today we're unpacking that argument, specifically what Darwin actually claimed, what the author says he failed to demonstrate, and why academia has held on to his hypothesis for over a century anyway. By the end of this episode, you'll have a much sharper sense of the difference between a scientific hypothesis and a scientific theory, and why that distinction matters more than most of us were ever taught. I've got someone here who has gone deep into this author's thesis, so let's get into it. Walk me through what this author is actually arguing.
So the author's central argument is really about methodology, about what counts as science and what doesn't. And the claim is that Darwinism, as it's taught today, has never actually cleared the bar required to be called a scientific theory. It's still, technically, a hypothesis.
Wait, a hypothesis? Like, after all this time?
That's exactly the author's position. And to understand why, you have to understand what the empirical method actually requires. It's not just about publishing a paper. The author is very clear on this. Publishing a document does not in itself result in science. What's required is that you test your hypothesis, verify it through reproducible results, and then submit it to peer review. And peer review isn't a thumbs up or thumbs down situation. It's a mandatory process every scientific hypothesis must go through before it can be considered science.
So the author is saying Darwin skipped that process?
Not exactly. The author actually gives Darwin himself a pass. Darwin was born in 1809, and the empirical method was only just being conceived at that point. It was, as the author puts it, poorly articulated in Darwin's era. So Darwin gets some grace. The problem, the author argues, is with Darwin's successors, the people who took his work and elevated it to the status of accepted theory without ever actually proving the mechanism.
And what is the mechanism we're talking about here?
Natural selection. The idea that species evolve through a process where advantageous traits get passed on and less advantageous ones die out. The author's argument is that no mechanism of evolution has ever been identified or observed to have occurred in nature. And if it hasn't been observed and replicated, it cannot, by the rules of empirical method, be elevated from hypothesis to theory.
Okay, so that's a pretty bold claim. But here's what I want to push on. The author is also making a point about who actually came up with natural selection in the first place, right? Because it wasn't Darwin?
This is one of the more surprising parts of the essay. The author argues that most biology professors teach that Darwin advanced the mechanism of natural selection. But in fact, it was Alfred Russel Wallace who first proposed natural selection as a mechanism for the diversification of species. Darwin, according to the author, compiled a large amount of material illustrating what he claimed were traits attributable to natural selection, but the concept itself came from Wallace.
So Darwin gets the credit for someone else's idea?
That's the author's position. And it goes even deeper than that, because Wallace himself was building on the work of Thomas Malthus. Malthus was the one who first used statistical methods to analyze population trends and predict that populations would bottleneck and crash. The author describes Malthus as essentially the Greta Thunberg of his day, someone whose numbers had staggering implications and who was sounding an alarm that most people weren't ready to hear.
That's a vivid comparison. So the intellectual lineage is Malthus, then Wallace, then Darwin, and Darwin ends up with all the fame.
Exactly. And the author points out that Wallace himself would have rejected the attribution because he saw himself as expanding on Malthus. So you have this chain of ideas where each person is building on the last, and somehow Darwin ends up as the face of the whole thing.
Let's talk about what Darwin was actually doing during this period, because I think the historical context matters here. What was the scientific landscape like when Darwin was writing?
It was radically different from today. The author makes this point really vividly. In Darwin's era, a simple paper cut could become infected and kill you. Germ theory hadn't been established yet. Diseases were still widely believed to be punishments or consequences of individual sins. The author notes that mankind wouldn't overcome the guilt and shame associated with disease until 1905, when it was proven that diseases were caused by pathogens, not moral failings.
So Darwin was writing in a world where the basic tools of modern biology didn't even exist yet.
Right. And the author traces this back even further to Ibn Sal's original breakthrough in optics, which eventually allowed scientists to discover and treat microbial infections. The microscope, the telescope, all of this flows from that single invention. And the author's broader thesis is that each of these epiphanic moments in scientific history created a kind of cognitive dissonance that had real social consequences.
That's a fascinating framing. But let's stay with Darwin for a moment, because I want to get to what the author says Darwin actually contributed and what he didn't.
So the author is actually quite generous in acknowledging Darwin's real contribution. The claim is that Darwin made an extraordinary contribution toward documenting the process of hybridization in species. He observed and recorded variations within species, things like plumage varying within bird species. That's real, documented work.
But
hybridization within a species is not the same thing as differentiation between species. And that's Darwin's actual claim, that species differentiate and new species emerge. The author argues Darwin never identified how any particular trait imparted a survival advantage, and never offered a single example in biological history where a proposed advantage rendered the survivors of a population bottleneck a new and distinct species.
So Darwin documented variation, but couldn't explain the leap from variation to new species.
That's the author's argument. And here's where it gets really interesting. The author points to Darwin's later pivot to sexual selection as evidence that Darwin himself recognized this problem. Darwin abandoned attempts to prove or disprove natural selection and focused almost exclusively on sexual selection later in his career.
Why would that be significant?
Because the author reads it as Darwin quietly acknowledging that the fossil record didn't support survival of the fittest. And the author makes this really striking point. What was T-Rex lacking that made it unfit to survive? If anything, the fossil record shows over and over again that it was the meekest species that inherited the Earth after every major extinction event, not the apex predators.
Oh, that's a genuinely good point. The dinosaurs were the apex predators, and they're gone.
Exactly. So the author argues Darwin realized the simplicity, and thus the fallacy, of survival of the fittest, and switched to sexual selection. But here's the problem with that pivot. The very definition of species hinges on the ability to procreate. Any male and female producing offspring are, by definition, the same species as their offspring. So, sexual selection as a mechanism for the origin of new species doesn't actually solve the problem Darwin was trying to solve.
So Darwin painted himself into a corner.
That's one way to read it. And the author goes further, claiming that Darwin recanted his own life's work before he died in 1882. Now, the author is careful here. They acknowledge that skeptics will push back hard on this claim, and that there's more evidence in favor of dismissing it than accepting it. But the author's point is that Darwin's own trajectory, abandoning natural selection, pivoting to sexual selection, confirms in his deeds what he may not have said explicitly.
I appreciate that the author flags the uncertainty there. That's intellectually honest. But let me ask the obvious question. If Darwin's hypothesis has these problems, why has academia held onto it so tightly for over a century?
This is where the author's argument gets really pointed. The claim is that accredited academia clings to Darwin's Origins of Species not because its efficacy has been proven, but because there is nothing else on the shelf. No alternative mechanism of evolution has been proposed that has passed peer review. So evolutionary biologists are, in the author's words, drowning men clinging to a life preserver.
That's a pretty unsparing image.
It is. And the author adds a structural dimension to it. The majority of all PhDs earned in the field of biology over the last century are predicated on the popular validity of Darwin's hypothesis. Every book report, every senior thesis, every major treatise is replete with footnotes and cross-references, all traceable back to Darwin. So it's not just that academics believe in Darwin, it's that their entire careers are built on the assumption that Darwin is correct.
So there's an institutional inertia that makes it almost impossible to revise the record.
Exactly. And the author frames this as a form of idolatry, not in a religious sense, but in the sense that scientists can become more devoted to their hypothesis than to manifest truth. The author says when scientists are more devoted to their hypothesis than to what's actually demonstrable, that is a form of idolatry. And the author argues we're all susceptible to it because we define ourselves too much by what we believe.
That's a really interesting framing. It's not an attack on science, it's an attack on the human tendency to protect our beliefs even when the evidence gets complicated.
Right. And the author is careful to distinguish between science as a standard and scientific as an adjective. Scientific is a word describing something that appears to be grounded in science. Science is the standard every field works to achieve. The author notes that only mathematics has been elevated to a truly reliable state. All other sciences are, in the author's words, a work in progress.
Okay, I want to bring up something that I think is important and maybe uncomfortable. The author connects Darwin's work to some very dark historical consequences. Can you walk through that argument?
Yeah, this is where the essay takes a much darker turn. The author argues that Darwin's work, combined with Malthus's population theories, formed an extremely dangerous intellectual current by the early 20th century. And the author points to a specific moment, a group of thinkers meeting at Café Central in Vienna around 1910, including figures like Alfred Adler, Leon Trotsky, and Joseph Stalin, with a young Adolf Hitler reportedly on the periphery.
Wait, all of those people were in the same cafe?
That's what the author describes. And the argument is that by that point, Malthus and Darwin had combined to create a framework in which certain groups could be classified as scientifically inferior, which the author sees as the intellectual foundation for the eugenics movement and ultimately for the atrocities of the 20th century. The author's thesis is that the Holocaust should not be attributed solely to a furious goose-stepping Nazi, but to a fatal flaw within accredited academia, specifically, the failure to maintain the integrity of peer review.
That is a sweeping claim, and I imagine it's a controversial one.
It is. The author is essentially arguing that when hypothesis is presented to the general public as settled science instead of mere hypothesis, the consequences can be catastrophic. And the author is very specific. None of the justifications used by the socialist movements of the 20th century were based on anything that passed peer review. They were pseudoscience dressed up as science.
And Darwin's noble savage label plays into this too, right? The author mentions that specifically.
Yes, during his famous voyage on the Beagle, Darwin labeled the indigenous people of Tierra del Fuego as Fuegian savages. The author describes this as reckless, callous, and ignorant, a dehumanizing critique applied to a distant culture. And the author argues that Darwin's hybridization work, combined with this kind of language, leads directly to eugenics and to the National Socialist movement's War of Extinction in 1939.
So the author isn't saying Darwin intended any of that, but that his ideas, misapplied and elevated beyond what the evidence supported, contributed to a very dangerous intellectual environment.
That's the argument. And the author frames the broader series of essays as charting 13 epiphanic thresholds in human history, moments where a new discovery created cognitive dissonance, and where the failure to handle that dissonance responsibly led to social upheaval and human rights violations. Darwin is one chapter in that larger story.
And the author traces all of it back to Ibn Sal's lens, the invention of optics.
Right. The telescope, the microscope, germ theory, Darwin, it all flows from that single invention. The author uses it as a through line to show how one discovery after another redefined what humans thought they knew, and how each redefinition created a new crisis of belief. It's a genuinely ambitious intellectual project.
Let me push back on one thing, though. The author's argument about peer review and the empirical method is compelling in principle, but isn't there a version of this where the author is holding Darwin to a standard that didn't fully exist yet? You said the author gives Darwin a pass, but the critique of his successors seems to assume the rules were clear much earlier than they actually were.
That's a fair tension in the essay. The author does acknowledge that Darwin and his colleagues were aware of process over product, that even in Darwin's era, there was an understanding that science required more than just publishing ideas. But the author's sharpest criticism is really directed at the modern academy, at the people today who continue to present Darwinism as settled science when, by the author's reading of empirical method, it hasn't cleared that bar.
So the failure isn't Darwin's, it's the institutions.
Largely, yes. The author says accredited academia is attempting to rehabilitate nearly every major treatise on evolutionary biology offered between 1855 and 1926. And 1926 is a significant year in the essay. That's when the genome was confirmed in microscopy. The author describes it as the day when it was discovered that life was being created over and over again by software stored at the center of every cell. That discovery, the author implies, should have forced a reckoning with Darwin's hypothesis.
And did it?
The author doesn't fully answer that in this essay. They note we're a long way from 1926 in the narrative and that the implications of genetics for Darwinian apologetics will be explored further. But the implication is clear. The discovery of the genome should have been a moment of reckoning, and the author believes it wasn't treated as one.
There's something almost poignant about that, the idea that the very tool that could have resolved the debate, the genome, arrived and the debate just continued.
And that's really the heart of the author's frustration. It's not that Darwin was a bad scientist for his time. It's that the institution built around his name has become resistant to the kind of honest scrutiny that science is supposed to demand of itself. The author puts it plainly. What every major religion instructs, and what peer review of science enforces, is that we are our own worst counsel. Accepting that is the most difficult challenge for any free-thinking individual to overcome.
That's a line that sticks with you. Okay, so when you step back from everything the author is arguing here, what's the core takeaway? What does this essay actually want us to walk away thinking?
I think the author wants us to hold two things at once. First, Darwin made a real and genuine contribution. Documenting variation and hybridization within species is meaningful scientific work. The author says so explicitly and openly. But second, that contribution was overstated, misattributed in part to Darwin when Wallace and Malthus deserve more credit, and then institutionally entrenched in ways that made honest revision nearly impossible.
And the stakes of getting that wrong aren't abstract. The author is arguing they're historical and human.
Exactly. The author's broader thesis is that every time academia crosses an epiphanic threshold and gains paradigm-shifting knowledge, the failure to handle that knowledge responsibly, to subject it to rigorous peer review, to distinguish hypothesis from theory, results in social upheaval and human rights violations. And with each new epiphany, the severity of the resulting upheaval is amplified. Darwin is one node in that chain, not the whole chain.
So the lesson isn't really about Darwin specifically, it's about what happens when institutions protect their own beliefs instead of doing the hard work of honest scrutiny.
That's the author's diagnosis, and it applies to both religion and science. The author is careful to say that theologians who are more devoted to their interpretations of Scripture than to manifest truth are committing the same error as scientists who are more devoted to their hypothesis than to what's actually demonstrable. The failure mode is the same. Only the vocabulary is different.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. The author is asking us to take the rules of science seriously. Not to dismiss science, but to hold it to its own stated standards. And when we do that with Darwin, the picture gets a lot more complicated than what most of us were taught.
Right. And the author's challenge to the reader is direct. Go to any major university, read the publishing dates of any theory that still remains on the books, and you'll find that the majority of operative theories were confirmed within the last 100 years. What passed as scientific knowledge before that was, in the author's words, for the most part, dangerously flawed. Darwin's era is no exception.
The author even suggests reading a medical textbook from before 1900 and following its recommended treatments, and notes that if you're seriously ill, you probably shouldn't, because you'd likely harm yourself.
It's a darkly funny way to make the point, but it lands. We look back at pre-1900 medicine, and we're horrified. The author is asking, why don't we apply that same critical lens to pre-1926 evolutionary biology?
And the answer, according to the author, is institutional self-interest. A century of careers and credentials built on Darwin make it very hard to ask that question honestly.
Which is why the author frames this as a failure of peer review, not a failure of individual scientists. The system is supposed to prevent this kind of entrenchment. When it doesn't, when hypothesis gets presented to the public as settled science, the consequences, historically, have been severe.
So what's the actionable insight here for someone listening? What do we actually do with this?
I think the author's implicit ask is that we become more careful readers of scientific consensus. Not cynical, the author isn't saying science is worthless, but careful. When someone tells you something is settled science, ask, has a mechanism been identified? Has it been observed? Has it been replicated? Those aren't hostile questions. They're the questions science is supposed to demand of itself.
And the author would say that if you ask those questions about Darwinism, the honest answer is not yet.
That's the argument. And the author closes with something worth sitting with. The claim that Darwin's only lasting contribution to scientific endeavor, beyond the documentation of variation within species, was the noble savage label he applied to the Fuegians of Tierra del Fuego. And that label, the author argues, contributed to a dehumanizing framework that caused untold misery to indigenous people everywhere, to this very day.
That's a sobering note to end on, and it connects back to the author's broader point that ideas have consequences, and that the failure to subject ideas to rigorous scrutiny before presenting them as truth is not a victimless error.
Exactly. The author's series is called A March Toward the Holocaust, and the argument is that the march didn't begin with a dictator. It began with a series of intellectual failures, each one building on the last, each one amplifying the consequences of the one before. Darwin is one step in that march. Not the first, not the last, but a significant one.
We started this episode with the idea that Darwin is treated as the unquestioned father of modern biology. his name on every textbook, his hypothesis taught as settled science. And what the author is really asking is, what if we've been so busy celebrating the man that we forgot to do the work of actually proving his ideas?
And what if the cost of that forgetting is higher than we've been willing to admit? That's the question the author leaves us with. It's not a comfortable one, but the author would say that discomfort is exactly what honest inquiry is supposed to feel like.
The next time someone tells you Darwin proved evolution, you now know the more complicated, more interesting, and, if the author is right, more consequential truth. The hypothesis is still on the shelf. The proof never arrived. And a century of careers built on that hypothesis have made it very hard for anyone to say so out loud.